Aloha, welcome to this week's video. So this week I'm going to be making two daggers, Hawaiian style daggers called pahoa. I have quite a bit of material left over from that epoxy combination I made, and so I'm going to be using some of that leftover for the handles of these two pahoa. Now these are going to be marlin tipped pahoa, and so one of the first things I have to do is I need to prep or stabilize the marlin bills. If you've seen some of my other videos, you've seen this process before, but all I do here, these bills were mostly dried, and so I didn't really have to dry them, which was nice. I've had them for a while. I just hollowed out the core, the center, and now I'm filling it with an epoxy. Normally I'd use like a low viscous epoxy, but my workshop is a little bit too cold, and so I used a faster setting epoxy, and it worked out well. I prefer the low viscous epoxy because it fills into the cracks a little bit better. It just takes a lot longer to set, but it's okay. So all I'm doing here is I'm not really measuring out the distance that these are. I'm just kind of getting their widest length and then cutting these down to match. That'll just reduce some time in shaping, and it'll also help me keep them straight. One thing that I was kind of interested in is the strength of the bonds. And what blew my mind is the epoxy is actually stronger than the wood. I wasn't quite expecting that. I was kind of expecting it to break at the connection point, but sure enough, the wood would break before the epoxy would break, which was pretty interesting to me. So here's both pieces. One of the first steps I need to do now that I have them roughly about where I want them with regards to their length and dimension is I'm going to be cutting in the joint. So the joint that's going to be used for these is similar to a mortise and tenon joint like you see here. It's not going to be inset into the piece. It's more just going to fit into it. But I like that style of joint. There's probably multiple ways of doing it. This is just the style of joint that I really like for these. And then once I set in the joint, I usually put in a cross pin just to add some mechanical strength to it as well. All I'm doing here is I'm making these a pretty tight fit. I want them to be close. I don't want very much play. I am going to be epoxying them together, but I still want to reduce the total movement that's in the joint. One, because it makes it easier to epoxy the joint, and two, I think it makes for a stronger bond anyway. I could use wood glue, but I've never used wood glue for this section of it just because it's the marlin bill and then wood, and I don't know how the wood glue is going to work with the marlin bill. And so I kind of prefer epoxy because the marlin bone is porous and the epoxy is going to fill in those pores. It's already filled in the pores a little bit because of the center pore that I did, but any additional hollow areas this will fill in, and I think it just makes for a stronger bond. And so all I'm doing here is I'm just putting the epoxy on all edges, and then you can see on that first pahoa or dagger body there, the handle, I taped up the top section where I cut out the groove. I did that for a couple of reasons. One is it keeps it from becoming a mess. That way, as it squeezes out, it doesn't go all over the place. But really the primary reason is there is going to be space between the edges of the wood and the marlin bill, and this will kind of just force the epoxy to kind of fill in and reduce the chance that I have of air bubbles. Air bubbles are kind of a pain. They reduce the strength. They're hard to fix once you get them. I mean, you can always fill them with epoxy. It's just easier if you don't have them to begin with. So that's all I'm doing here is putting just a little bit in there, enough that it kind of squeezes all the way around, and then I'll be removing some of that excess. There shouldn't be much. You don't want to fill it so it's just overflowing. You want it to be just about perfect, which is what I have here. So I'm going to go ahead and set this one, and then I'm going to go ahead and prep the second one and get the second one ready to go. The marlin bill on this first one was a little bit shorter of a marlin bill, but thicker. These marlin bills here are stripers. So stripers are just a smaller marlin. The blue marlin bills, those are the really large marlin bills, and I use those usually for ihe or short spears. I have occasionally used them for like a sword. They're not my favorite bill to use for a sword. I prefer the swordfish bill because it's more of a flat, already looks like a sword. But for these pahoa, these stripers were great. Love it. So I'd already prepped this one. Right now I'm just filling that inside with the epoxy. Now the epoxy that I'm using here is a quick setting epoxy, so it's different than the epoxy that was filled to make the handle material. I do that just because that other epoxy that makes the handle material takes like 2 weeks in this cold weather to fully set. And I wanted it to set a little bit faster. So what I'm doing here is just making sure it's everything is good and straight. That one had a little bit more room to play, and so I put some extra tape on it to hold it there. So here I have the finished, or rather the set pieces. Now that I have them almost ready to start shaping, I'm going to go ahead and drill my cross pegs. So I'm using a 1/4-inch dowel. I could use koa wood, so this is the only piece that isn't koa wood, is this dowel. I could make my own dowels, but you know, sometimes it's easier just to go get a dowel. So I keep a couple different dimensions of dowel. I keep a 1/4-inch, I keep a 1/2 inch, I keep a 3/4 inch, and a 1 inch, and I use them for a variety of reasons. So all I'm doing here is I'm just drilling this all the way through, and this is just going to add some additional mechanical strength to the piece, just like knife scales on a knife. This way, if by chance the epoxy comes free or becomes weakened, the dowels are going to help. Now, one thing you'll notice here is I'm using both epoxy and wood glue. So one of these daggers has the joint just where it connects to the bill to the handle material ended up being largely epoxy. The wood stopped and it was epoxy after that. So I figured using an epoxy bond would be better, and that's this first one here. So that the epoxy, I think, is just going to sit better with the other epoxy. And then this other piece here was largely wood. So same thing, I figured the wood glue would make a better bond. I probably could have done either or. Actually, no, if I would have done one, I would have done epoxy to both rather than wood glue to one of them. I wouldn't do wood glue to both because I don't know how the wood glue would adhere to the epoxy. But I think this will work great. I didn't let this sit for as long just because there's no, at this point in time, the original joint with the epoxy is holding sufficient. And so there's no actual stress on it, on that joint there with the dowel that goes through it. So I let it sit for about 15-20 minutes, and now I'm beginning my shaping. Now the one thing that I don't like about this material that I have, the epoxy / wood material, is, man, does it make so much dust. I mean, it is insane how much the epoxy kicks up. And so I definitely had to wear my respirator for this. I do have pretty good air flow and air ventilation, so you can see right there how the dust all goes to that one direction. That's because I have a ginormous air filter that I set up. And I use that air filter to pull out fine particles out of the air. And then I have some other dust collection to keep the air clean. But epoxy, I definitely didn't want to breathe it in. I just was getting all over, and so I made sure to wear my respirator while I was working. I decided on 2 different styles for the handles. So one style is a cylindrical style, kind of a basic shape. And then the other one, so the one I'm working on now is the cylindrical one. The other one was kind of like hexagonal. Man, I can't speak. So it has straight edges. And it did have 6 edges all the way around. And I had those edges go all the way to the end of the piece. And I really liked it, actually. It's a style I've done before. It's not a traditional style. It's definitely my own style. But I really like the amount of grip it adds to the piece. You can really index with the piece when you're swinging it. And so I've been a big fan of it. I also like the edges, the sharp edges. I think that looked pretty slick. I ended up sanding these down to 800. I was originally just going to do them to 320, but I really, really wanted to bring out the contrast between the epoxy and the wood grain. On top of that, I was super excited to oil this piece. So I ended up skipping. I went out of order. I don't normally oil at this point in time. Normally, I oil it much later. after I've put in the teeth and drilled the holes. But I wasn't worried on this piece because I wasn't going to be drilling into the wood. I was only going to be drilling into the marlin bill. And so I wasn't concerned with it. And so we get a sneak peek right away with the oil and the true color of the piece. And oh man, did it turn out just awesome. Look at that. So the epoxy is the pigment that I put into the epoxy. It was a dry pigment. And you mixed it in. As I was mixing it, it was midnight blue, and I mixed it really dark. And so it's almost non-transparent, and it's almost black. It's just a dark blue, and you can kind of see a little bit of like a galaxy look to it. It looks awesome. And then the contrast between that and the koa wood was just absolutely beautiful. Loved it. One of my favorite pieces to date with regards to just the contrast and color. And then the other piece is quite a bit different. I was actually happy about that. I really liked the difference between the two. But look at that. Look at that contrast. Absolutely beautiful. I am loving this material. I am definitely going to be doing this again in the future. But man, is it awesome. So here's the second piece. And you can kind of see those straight edges here. I really liked the chaos of this piece. You'll notice that one section has epoxy almost all the way down it. I thought about sanding that all the way down and getting rid of it, but I really liked it. I just liked how this piece was so chaotic. It wasn't as clean cut as the other one. It just gave it its own different feel, its own different look, and I was really pleased with it. So now that I have it oiled, I'm going to go back to what would have been earlier steps. I still need to cut out the grooves in the marlin bill, put in the teeth, and then lash the feathers into place as well as the teeth. So the first step here, all I'm doing with the marking here is I'm making sure that the grooves are the same length on both sides and they stay in line with one another. It's really noticeable if one is offset compared to the other. So you have to be careful with that. To cut in the grooves, I use my Dremel and the tungsten carbide bit. The tungsten carbide bit here, that I can't remember the exact size of this piece. I want to say it's 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch. It tapers. So at one end, it's like an 1/8, and then it tapers up to 1/4. I've just used it for ages, and so it's how I cut the grooves in both the marlin bills and the wood. I'm sure there's better ways of doing it. It's just how I've done it, and I've gotten very comfortable with it. So once I cut in the grooves, I fill in a little bit of clear epoxy into the groove, and I set the teeth. I do that just because it helps with the next steps. So the epoxy is not the primary hold. The lashing is the primary mechanical hold. The epoxy really just helps it so that when I go to drill out the teeth, it keeps them in place. I don't necessarily need it. I have done it without it, but it just takes a lot more time and is a lot more of a hassle. And when I go to lash, it's a big pain in the butt. And so I really like just putting in a little bit of epoxy, and it really helps with the next steps. Here's the same thing. I'm just punching in the holes through the teeth using that tungsten carbide bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and drill my center holes. So I ended up drilling these with just a basic setup, and so it's going to create a triangle on both sides, which actually kind of creates a diamond shape. Ends up looking really cool. I use this almost always when it comes to the marlin bills. I just like the look of the lashing on it. Lashing here is pretty fast, actually. Most of the time, lashing takes forever, just because there's not as many teeth. The lashing is quite a bit faster. You'll notice, though, I have a needle there, and what that's for is as I'm lashing, I've got a 4-ply going through those center holes. So each tooth is lashed twice. I've got 2 sides, so that's 4 strands of lashing going through each of those center holes. And so as I get to the 3rd and 4th ply, I end up needing that needle to help get the cordage through. It's kind of a pain without it. So what I'm doing here is, in preparation for lashing the feathers, which I've taped into place, I'm putting in a groove onto the marlin bill. I do that because the marlin bill tapers, and so if you try to lash it without a groove, something for the lashing to the cordage to rest into place, it'll just slide down the bill, and it won't sit. And so I put in a groove, and then from there I begin the feather lash. So this is a pretty basic lashing. I'm just gonna wrap all the way around and then pull it through to tighten it up. The one thing that I do is I usually tie a knot on both ends. It's probably not strictly necessary, but I haven't ever had it come loose in doing that, and so it's kind of why I like to. So here you can see me pulling it through, and then I tie a double knot on this side so that as I pull it through, it grabs onto that knot and tightens the whole wrap even more. And then I tie a knot on the other side just so that it doesn't come loose. That way there really isn't a clean way for it to work its way back out. The knot will prevent it from doing that. And then I make sure to tie that single knot as close as I can. And then once I've tied those knots, I cut off most of the ends, and then I just kind of, using a needle here, I push the ends back in underneath the lashing. Just cleans it up, makes it look a lot nicer. It's a lot neater. And it actually sometimes will hide the knot as well. So if you have any natural divots in the bill, I'll push the knot into there. So here's the finished piece. So this is inside of my shop. And so it has the warm light of my shop. I'm going to be taking it outside here in just a minute. But I really loved these pieces. I like how both of them worked out. Now let's go ahead and take them outside and see what they look like in the natural light. So check this out. So this is the first piece, the cylindrical piece. There's that diamond shape in the lashing I was referencing before. The accent between the dark epoxy and the wood and the feathers and the marlin bill and the tiger shark teeth. Man, this just turned into an awesome piece. Very pleased with it, very happy with it. I think I like this one a little bit better, but at the same time, I love the chaotic nature of this piece. So you can see the different cuts and grooves in the wood, the epoxy overlay. It's just a very chaotic piece, and then it has those hexagonal shape there. You can see all those different planes and the straight edges. It just looked awesome. Loved it. Now last video I didn't test. That's because I was reforming my ballistics gel. So let's get my ballistics gel out and let's have some fun with these pieces. So I'm just going to do just a stabbing test. Now I actually, I went at it pretty decent. Not as hard as I really thought I was going to. And that first piece just stabbed right in. Man, I can't imagine getting stabbed with that. That would hurt so bad. That went in a good maybe 4.5 inches. That was crazy. So here's the second one. Now this one has a thicker body, so I'm not expecting it to go as deep. Sure enough, it didn't. But it still went a good 2.5, 3 inches into the ballistics gel. That would still cause an enormous amount of damage. It'd be extremely painful. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I know I really did. This was a lot of fun. If you liked it, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Mahalo.